Greetings, friend. It's really quite amazing to be able to share this space, and also was amazing for me to discover all of the different convergences in our trajectories and our life experiences. Um, there are not that many people who have done PhDs in exploring Buddhist study, practice, and also have trained with Tibetan teachers and have that kind of grounding in lineage and in tradition. Um, and then also this exploration in particular of Buddhist animisms, I think we're both moved by a sense of what this moment, this historic moment, the polycrises is asking of us and requiring of us, and what we would need to draw on to make responses to that as a way to move towards the human and the set of concerns that we share. But we also are moved by the sort of inner earthquake or tsunami after exposure of systemic abuse in the Buddhist spaces that we each knew. And in that upheaval, having to sift through or having the opportunity to allow things to settle differently in our practice and in our worldview. Um, and so this sense that humanity doesn't need another exploitative structure, no matter how many contributions it makes to people's wellness, and wanting to expand the understanding of suffering to include structural violence. I think those are things that we, for all these different kind of collections of reasons, are really sharing. So when I approached you to co-facilitate with Karen Wakanda Lewis this retreat on Buddhist animisms, I did so because I knew some of that, and I thought it would be wonderful to co-facilitate a retreat. It was a delight to me to find out that actually Buddhist animisms was precisely the retreat was going to be on Buddhist animisms, and your response was like, I'm already there. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit about, your own trajectory, if you want, or why it is that you feel that exploring animist aesthetics or ways of being is important to Buddhist practice or important to this particular moment.
Yes, yes. Thanks, Damcho, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to your Sangha for inviting me. Yeah, exactly as you just shared, I'm also amazed at how much convergence there is in our different paths. And yeah, starting, maybe you mentioned the PhD, the academic side first. And so, yeah, there is a certain kind of formation and training that happens when you go through a modern academic path, which is quite rigorous and it's its own journey. And there are really positive aspects of that and challenging aspects. And knowing that we both share that allows a certain entrance into any exploration, but including Buddhist animism. So for me, the positive aspects of that academic formation include just access to a vast range of materials, texts, but also how to read them and how to ask questions and struggle and challenge yourself. So it's wonderful that both of us share that approach and style. Maybe on the more challenging or negative side, I've also known quite a few Buddhists to enter into an academic path and kind of not really emerge, or if they do emerge, they leave their Dharma practice and their spiritual life behind because you're exposed to so much critical perspective. And so both of us have found our way to navigate that labyrinth and come out with still some spirituality intact and powerful, but also with those critical skills. And then, yes, both of us share a very extensive, long Dharma path and practice where we have both been teachers and empowered to teach. And also, we're really in the cauldron of Vajrayana Buddhism, of a Tibetan cultural context and cosmology and relationships. and we benefited tremendously from that. We both, share so much appreciation for the learning and depth of experience. And I do think that being in a Vajrayana community, the way both of us were in different communities, is unique within modern Buddhism in some ways. Just the amount of cultural difference, especially you lived in Asia for a long time, and I've lived in Asia for smaller portions, but definitely lived within this cauldron of a very different world. And of course, part of that world in the Vajrayana, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, is an animism, is a certain relationship with a more than human world, with a magical world packed full of spirits and deities and protectors and ancient histories and sacred pilgrimage sites and magical beings and just this kind of psychedelic, swirling universe that is very different from the universe that many modern people are socialized into. And so, given that background, it's no wonder that we have a certain openness to a more than human world, and grappling with what that might mean. And then, as you did say, Damcha, as well, part of that cauldron and part of being in an intensive uh, context meant being exposed to some of the abuses and challenges of that world, which is not, everywhere, but it's quite common, more than many people realize, that with these ancient cosmologies can sometimes come patriarchy and abuses of power, sexual abuses that both of us have been aware of, and as you said too, that provided an opportunity to receive so much teaching and blessing and formation, and also at some point to wonder where we do see something differently, and we want to proceed in a slightly different way than maybe we were trained.
Mhm.
So all of that, for me, converges in this ecological and political moment, where it is not simply because of a love or a reverence for the wonder of the planet, but also deep ethical pain and moral woundedness and frustration and anger and grief and questioning about what it means to be part of a civilization that is destroying the richness and natural systems that we depend on for our very physical existence, let alone spiritual existence. And so, yeah, when you put all of that together, the academic training, the spiritual formation, the deep immersion in a Tibetan magical world, the challenges of that world, and this ecological crisis, it does make sense that both of us have found our way into a deep exploration of Buddhism and animism.
Just as you're speaking, I think there might be another piece here that sort of positions us in such a place with respect to the rest of mainstream Buddhism, which is that the the way in which the process of transmitting Buddhist teachings to North American and European students has been very much an attunedness to the valuing of scientific materialism that takes place, which has devalued a lot of the teachings that go beyond a very scientific, rational understanding. So elements of the cosmovision that are not compatible with that, and teachings on past and future lives often don't make the cut in that process. And I think partly because the academic training obliges you to see a tradition in its totality and not just the pieces that are resonating with you, which can be why some people fall out of resonance when they move into that space, into the academic space. Um, but also, the exposure or the immersion in the Asian, Tibetan ways of practicing and being did make us alive to riches that actually often get filtered out. And so when people are turning, a lot of times when people want to construct an eco dharma, that piece, I think, would be very alive if it were present, but it's often just not present in the understanding of what Buddhism is really about.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a good and complex door to walk through. On the one hand, you could say there is exactly as you're saying, there's this kind of modern Buddhism or Buddhist modernism that wants to, remove the cultural baggage. A secularized Buddhism or a naturalized Buddhism, to use a more formal philosophical term, to try to make Buddhism fit into a modern scientific cosmology or scientistic cosmology. And some of that is removing karma, removing rebirth, removing spirits, removing more than human energies and presences, and many other things that are foreign seeming. And, there's something natural there about a culture trying to make sense of a different tradition. But there's also a violence there, or an epistemicide, right? A killing off of a different way of knowing, a different way of worlding the world. Um, and so, that is certainly part of this colonial history of the Dharma coming into modernity. Then there's another side too, which is I think that the ways in which modern people can feel such a lack of magic or disenchantment and and can turn to Buddhism or other ancient traditions to try to fill that lack and try to discover magic or discover something that has been lost or something that even our European ancestors might have had that has been taken from us through the process of either Christianization or colonization or the scientific revolution. But it's interesting because both of these sides map onto Western modern categories, which are basically what I call the two twin siblings of modernity, which are the scientific revolution, the scientific materialist worldview. That's like the older, annoying brother that thinks he knows everything. And then you've got the other sibling, uh, and that's the sibling that likes to go wander out in the forest and write poetry, and that's the romantic movement. And that's the sensitive romantic tradition, which is also part of Western modernity. And often we forget that, and we think that the aesthetic and poetic and nature loving and open to magic, that is something outside of modernity or outside of Western modernity, but it's not. It's the twin siblings that are like in this family squabble, and they're always in an argument together. And and I'm interested in not being part of the family argument anymore. I'm interested in not being part of the dysfunction of this relentless debate between scientific versus romantic, between a dead world and a living world. I'm interested in experiencing this reality in a different way. I'm tired of having to choose between the two. And so there are some ways in which, for me, the word materialism, for example, is a good word. I mean, of course, it can be reductive, but it also can be so affirmative that it's in the materiality and elementality of existence that we do find the sacred, as
Yeah,
opposed to thinking
absolutely.
that it's somewhere else or has to be mapped on or, a vitalism brought into it. So, anyways, that's kind of how I relate with this, is find a different way than the battle between the two siblings.
And how do you sense that exploring or using the category or the point of departure that this word animisms opens up, how do you think that will help you to avoid that dispute? And maybe if you want, you can just kind of map out for people what you understand animisms to mean, and maybe share a little bit of the very uh, complicated history of the use of that term.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Damcho. I mean, first, let me just say on a more maybe biographical level, I I have always felt this sense of the living communication and presence of what we call nature, the more than human world, this earth. I wasn't raised by hippies or particularly spiritual parents, but I was raised in a town in the Northeast, surrounded by forest and deciduous forest and beautiful mosses and deer and wildlife, and I grew up running around in the woods. And
Me too.
yeah, another thing we share in common.
Yeah.
And to this day, there's something about, a spring or summer northeast deciduous forest that just is so sacred, so alive for me. Um, and of course, that life is everywhere. When I have traveled in Latin America and in all the many different kinds of ecosystems in Latin America or in Europe and in Asia, um, this planet is so alive, and that to me, for whatever reason, is self-evident, doesn't require a particularly rich uh, philosophical defense. It's just very clear in my just personally, experientially. And I've, always been interested in environmental issues and started my eighth grade environmental group and things like that. But I also, before I encountered Buddhism and before I encountered Tibetan Buddhism, was spending quite a lot of time with North and South American indigenous elders, shamans, and teachers. And in part, that was my own attempt to try to um, maybe connect with what we now are calling animism. And it was, I think, because of that, in part, that Tibetan Buddhism appealed to me in particular. Actually, aesthetically, I love the Zen world, the Japanese world. That to me is really much more beautiful, actually. Um, I don't want to, be sacrilegious or anything, but I think I might have become a monk if I could have worn all black robes. I couldn't do the maroon. Um, but I really appreciated the Zen aesthetic, but it was the Tibetan um, sense of a living cosmos and maybe even indigenous aspects of Central Asian tradition that were still alive in Tibetan Buddhism that I really connected with. And in particular, I connected with Trungpa Rinpoche's Shambhala teachings that really did emphasize this animate world filled with local spirits and presences. So that's just to say that there was something in me and probably in you that already attuned us to an interest and a longing there. Um, and in terms of animism more formally, that's a term that I'm still trying on. I think that you are still trying on. I'm not particularly wedded to it, but I do think it's a good word. And in part, it's because we're reclaiming it. So there's a recognition that the first use of the term animism from anthropologists like E.B. Taylor um, really saw animism as a kind of mistake, as a as part of a hierarchy or a evolutionary model of the development of human civilization. And of course, the peak of that development were Christian white men and rational scientists, and everyone else was on the ladder to try to get to their worldview. And so they saw the development of religion itself beginning from uh, indigenous perspectives that saw everything as animated with a certain spirit, that things were alive. And they saw this as a mistake. These anthropologists in the 1800s, 1900s saw this as childlike naivete and confusion, primitive.
And
And
very handily allowed the colonial project to continue because we've identified that these are, backward in their worldviews, don't actually need to be taken into consideration or taken seriously.
yeah, and that is a devastating part of this story. It wasn't just a kind of arrogant intellectual perspective, it was used to justify genocide. These are peoples who did not fully understand reality, and they therefore needed to be civilized And therefore, we have many, many examples of cultures and worldviews that were, very violently wiped out or, still survive, but despite tremendous aggression.
Mhm.
So, yeah, so animism does have a very dark history or you could say shadow or negative side to it. And so more recently, scholars, especially led by Graham Harvey, scholars have reclaimed this term in what we now call a new animism, which refers less to a belief in spirits, let's say, and more to a sense of a relational worldview that every day I walk by a certain large boulder and it points me home. It shows where I live. It shows where I need to make a turn in the path. And that boulder, I'm in relationship with that boulder, with that rock. And in a way, I'm in a more intimate relationship with that rock than many other humans that I don't encounter daily. And in that sense, that relationship, that relationality is very real, very immediate, and it's full of communication. And that can extend beyond that simple example to a sense that every river, every tree, every bird, everything we encounter, every element, I'm in a relationship with, you're in a relationship with, our communities are in relationship with. And as simple as that sounds, I think that opens up something really, really powerful for our understanding of animism. How do you understand the word? Why is it important to you?
Yeah, the elements of Buddhist teachings on interdependence, in which the boundary between self and other is really something to be questioned, in which we are not understanding ourselves to be a self, but a constellation of relations. Um, so for me, the phase that I'm in now in my spiritual path is much more focused. I think it's less focused on ontology, which was very important in a moment, like the ontology or the theory of reality that tells us how to be and suggests practices and in ethics, but really thinking about practices that resonate and feel meaningful and that aren't reproducing structures of harm, in which the boundary between self and world is experienced as porous. And so I'm at this moment I'm much more interested in an ethics of relationality, and but still having these different sets of concerns of what is the consequence of human action on the world around us. And when I think of animism, it is about relationality, but it's also about recognizing the plurality of subjectivities that our relationships are in play with or in dialogue with. And so awakening to a sense of aliveness everywhere. And then there's another piece of animism, some animisms where, and I want to like explore this in a Tibetan context, where we understand that we are living in a world full of spirit, and then the question is spirit lodged in certain physical objects? Is it separable from those objects? Is there like a spirit residing in a rock that has a different form that could pop out and show itself in a different form? Or is our world alive with aliveness? So these are the kinds of questions that I understand as being a logical sort of extension of Buddhist spiritual practice that's taking interdependence to be very like real and serious. And that means that my interdependence is not just with other human beings. It is absolutely, we are living in a way that's interconnected with all beings. And so a path to awakening that only focuses on human relationality can't can't be complete. Um, so I started out by saying I'm not worried about the theoretical underpinning, but it sort of pops up here and there.
Hmm.
So those are, and I think also, animism as a way of understanding that we live in a world of with a multiplicity of persons, not all of whom are human, as Graham Harvey will point out, um, is implicit in Buddhist teachings. There are many non-human beings who interact with the Buddha and who, are vibrating and intervening in our lives in lots of different ways, as the Tibetan tradition is so brilliant about exploring. Um, so I think also, in terms of use the term animist versus indigenous or indigenizing, um, for me, the term indigenous is, very much pointing to specific communities of human beings and their multiplicity of relationships to their non-human kin. And so thinking about the kind of trans local communities that we have in Buddhism, thinking that we're going to make ourselves indigenous moves in a different direction than thinking that we are drawing on the animist sources that are present in what we're doing, and we're trying to sort of see what might emerge from them. So that's sort of where I would say I am at the moment, and the answer will be different
Hmm.
probably tomorrow.
Yeah, there's a lot, a lot in there. Um, it reminds me, there's this French anthropologist, Philippe Descola, who's quite influential, and he was helpful to me because he broke down a few different worldviews basically on this topic. One of them is animism, which he describes as this sense of a world of spirit that we share. Any inner life, any mind resonates with any other subjective inner mind or inner life, and that's shared, even though there are different bodies.
Mhm,
But then he also talks about a second worldview that is held by many traditional cultures called totemism, and that he defines by saying that we actually, in addition to sharing minds, we also share bodies, that bodies actually change. And that even though a human body looks different from, let's say, a bear or a raven or a beaver body, actually we're part of a shared physicality. And that therefore a human clan can have a totem in relationship to an ancestor that now seems like a different body. But then a third area he calls analogism, which is a worldview of quite everybody being very different bodies and different minds, but yet in a vast web or tree of being where there is different lineages of connection. And the most important one, in some way, for me, is what he calls naturalism, which is the fourth. And that he defines as the European worldview, the modern European worldview, in which everything is seen as one nature, one physical cosmos, but then different ways of knowing it, different cultural perspectives. And I think many of us presume that perspective deep down, modern people. We presume there is an actual physical world, the earth, and then there's maybe different ways of experiencing it. What's so powerful about what De Cola is pointing to with these four is that actually that is just one kind of, in its own way, provincial type of perspective.
mhm,
That many, many people throughout history have not seen it that way, and even in the present do not see it that way, such as Amazonian perspectivism, which anthropologists have, been exploring. So all of this is to say is that it's a wonderful moment to recognize not just that modern civilization is life destroying in terms of ecological and habitat destruction, but that the worldview that underlies that, it can be questioned very deeply, very, very deeply, is not something that we should presume as solid.
But I want to just, before we talk about some of how this shows up in Buddhist communities and practices, I want to ask you what this exploration what you think this set of questions that we're exploring, how it enriches Buddhist practice
Yeah.
or a spiritual practice that's inspired by Buddhism, let's say.
I'm hesitating in part because, first of all, there's so many different Buddhist practices, right? What we mean by that. Somebody who has just become interested in mindfulness and is doing a little bit of breath meditation to reduce stress is a kind of modern Buddhism. Someone who is, deeply devoted to a Tibetan tradition and is willing to let go of pretty much every of their own assumptions and perspectives in order to be totally devoted to a medieval worldview. That's another kind of modern Buddhism, and everything in between. Um, for me, and I think we really share this in common, Damcho, what animism really opens up for Buddhist practice today, we could maybe say this on three levels. First of all, is a challenge to our preconceived worldviews, as opposed to choosing Buddhism because it confirms our preconceived worldviews. The second thing for me is really more eco-political, which is any spirituality, from my perspective, any spirituality that just wants to ignore the fact that we are rapidly mutating the planet in ways that most of us have not even metabolized, the loss, the destruction, the extinction, 73% of wildlife has been killed off on this planet. Most of the biomass of vertebrae are either human bodies or are cows and chickens and pigs. The loss of so much of forests, of coral reefs. There is no drinkable water on land surfaces for huge parts of the planet. There are, carcinogenic chemicals in the water cycles, let alone the changing of the climate, the rising of the temperatures, the superstorms, the fires, the floods, the deforestation. I mean, it is so extreme and so intense. And yet, many times Buddhist teachers don't even mention this. You can go through a whole cycle of training with incredible realized Vajrayana teachers, and they won't mention that. That to me is actually impossible. That is not acceptable. That is a kind of denial. That is a kind of
Bypass.
bypass. And so to open up to this, as you were saying, this relational cosmos, to take seriously our teachings of interdependence, of love, of bodhicitta, of actually feeling what we're doing to our planet, to each other, that means the world becomes animated, right? That love spills out beyond the edge of our body or even our worldview, and it pervades everything. That bodhicitta, awakened heart, means an awakening of this animacy of life, of everything. And that you could call it political or ethical. I don't know what to call it. To call it love. But we need a spirituality that is open to all of that. And then, the third area maybe is more magical, mystical, to just be a little trippy for a moment. I like to say this when I encounter a student who's like, I don't really, basically I just don't buy any of this stuff you're talking about. I often will say, well, just that's fine. I don't want you to, but I would encourage you to spend 2 or 3 nights alone in the mountains or the forest. And halfway through the time, just check yourself. Just notice. And it's true, like phenomenologically, when we step outside of some of the built environment and containers and kind of structures and forms of life that we're within in urban or just modern settings, and you go out onto the land and you let yourself listen and you let yourself smell and touch and look, it's undeniable that there's this ongoing communication. And it can arise in our dreams, it can arise in our body, it can arise with a very direct communication from the more than human world that in some ways are undeniable. The symbolic signs, omens, communication. And it only sounds weird when you're dislodged, when you're not in those spaces. But if you actually open, it to me is undeniable. And but just to kind of finish this full cycle, I believe that that also includes what's happening even in an urban or built environment. I think that that communication continues non-dually, not just in pristine wildlands, but it's everywhere all the time. The elements are everything. And so that sacredness, that mystical perspective is what we learn through, Maha Yoga, through generation stage, through tantric practice, through sadhana, um, through the sacred outlook, that Trungpa Rinpoche's term for the Vajrayana worldview, a sacred outlook, a kind of sangdak, and a direct encounter. It is sacred. And so animism opens that as well.
Let's continue, Adam, our exploration of what we intuit or hope thinking about Buddhist animisms might contribute to collective moment and to the world. And I wonder if you could talk me through some of the places in the transmission of Buddhism where you see animism, which maybe we want to just define again, in which you see that turning up.
Well, I think, attention to local and bioregional context is really helpful here. So much of animism, I think, has to do with place and intimacy with place. And so we could look at the very specific regions, cultures, landscapes where Buddhism emerged and developed. So you have India, you have Southeast Asia, you have the Himalayan and Tibetan region, you have China, East Asia, Korea, Japan, um, and each and more elsewhere. Each of these cultures is a slightly different story to be told and to discover. I think a few patterns may be more generalizable and universal. I think it's important to recognize that there is, an orthodox tendency in many philosophies, worldviews, religious traditions that wants to define itself against something that came before it. And sometimes that's helpful, sometimes that's needed. Sometimes it's helpful to have a philosophical position or a worldview that says, actually, we don't believe what grandma said. In a nutshell, this is what happened in what some historians call the axial age.
And this is the classic Tibetan strategy of gak shak pong, reject or negate what's already there, establish your own thing, and then defend it against any objection. So this is a very classical Tibetan approach to
Exactly.
establishing a position or a worldview.
Exactly. Yes. Well said. And yeah, and this happened all over, right? I mean, this is the beginning of Greek philosophy as well, with Socrates and Plato basically critiquing the mythic world that they were embedded in, and advocating for a certain kind of rationality, a certain way of asking questions. And that can have a bad rap, and we can be negative and critical about that. But there was something good that happened there too. There was something helpful that happened as well. And similarly, in the Buddhist context, I think the Buddha was indeed grappling with some of the received notions from the religious and political context of his time, and advocating for something actually quite radically new in some ways. And of course, where that tradition then traveled throughout India, Southeast Asia, up into the Himalayas and elsewhere, um, you could say it kind of carried with it some of that, as you were saying, like an establishment and a critical relationship with other perspectives. Um, so I don't want to just entirely be negative about the formation of the Buddhist tradition as its own unique worldview. I think that that has its place. Um, Given that context, though, there were older cultural traditions, which we could in general refer to as animist, wherever Buddhism went. And
Or indigenous in
or
that
indigenous,
context, I think.
maybe
Fair
indigenous
enough.
might be better, yeah. And or just cultural. I mean, it's hard, like it's these traditions, it's so old and so much complexity and so much changes. But let's say there was a really strong belief in local spirits, let's say tree spirits. And you do see signs of that in the Pali Canon, in the Mahayana texts, and certainly in the Tibetan world. You do see these animist presences that are just assumed. Like they're neither critiqued nor defended. They just assume that that's the way the world works. So I think maybe in general we could say that from my perspective, Buddhism either is critical of some animist perspectives and says it's that doesn't uphold the basic worldview and philosophy that that Buddhism believes or defends, or it just absorbs those animist worldviews and it gets included within it and enriches the Buddhist teachings. So the tradition you and I know most is the Tibetan tradition, and there you can really see how a pre-Buddhist indigenous way of being and relating to sky deities, to the Hua, to mountain deities, and the Nyen, to the earth and especially water, lower being dwellers, the Nagas, the Lu, that worldview was just assumed. And Buddhism interacted with that worldview and you could say brought a lot of those deities in, sometimes
Well, I
positively and sometimes critically.
yeah, my work was also in the Sanskritic Indian Buddhist tradition, and I don't necessarily think that Buddhism was bringing in new categories of beings. I think, and this is something that William Edelglass mentioned just the other day. I know that we're both friends with him. Um, that a lot of times there was a category that existed somewhere in Buddhist orthodoxy, and the local particular versions with all of their place-basedness and all their particular kin relationships could be incorporated in a known category. And I was quite a few years ago, I started teaching a 5-year course on the Vimalakirti Sutra.
Hmm.
And it's a 5-year course, so you get to like spend your time on everything. And I did a couple of classes on who the audience was. Like there's this, long passage in the beginning enumerating who was there. And and I spent some time with the 8 non-human beings. And this is Mahayana Sutras. It is a standard list of 8 non-human beings who interact with the Buddha and come to receive teachings from him. And that is as orthodox and traditional as it comes. And when you hear the list, so let's see if I can do it. Devas, Asuras, Gandharvas, Nagas, Garudas, Kinnaras, Mahoragas, and one other. Did I say Garudas? Anyway, there are 8 of them.
What are
Devas.
Maharajas? I know all the others. What?
They're shapeshifters.
Ah,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, they're very cool.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the entire textual tradition and ritual tradition of Buddhism, you have a more than human world. I don't think there is a way to deny that,
You have a more than human world that is alive with beings and persons.
including gods, right? Devas.
Hmm.
I mean, and this is something that I think the modern secular Buddhist world really hasn't grappled with. Um,
Yakshas, sorry.
oh, yakshas. Okay, good.
Yakshas, yeah.
Don't forget them.
Yeah, no, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious, right, that there's this really rich, living, and complex multiverse of many, many different kinds of beings and worlds, let alone the pure realms And, in Dzogchen, we talk about 13 billion world systems, and each one of them has a Buddha. And each one of those Buddhas in each of their hair pores is another whole universe. And each one of the hair pores of the Buddhas in that universe, there is, a glacial lake that is filled with whole mandalas. And I mean, it's just clearly an infinite and living perspective. Yeah, I mean, the sutras, the Mahayana sutras, let alone the tantric texts, the Mahayana sutras are so far out and they're so rich with different, worlds and meanings. Um, and there is this complex history in Tibet where the tantric tradition, the especially Padmasambhava, clearly was in an antagonistic relationship with what we now call the Bun or the pre-Buddhist world that was there, conquering deities and turning them into Dharma protectors.
Yeah, so maybe we just want to name this piece of Buddhist history that we're also inheriting, which is the often very, very close alignment between empire building projects, which includes what we would call you know, colonization and colonial settling, displacement of people from their lands in some sense. So there is this complicated history in which, you know, the relationship to local webs of relationship is very complicated, um, where you see ritual conquests and political conquests, happening hand in hand, symbolic, systems of meanings being imposed, and yet there is this kind of like spring that can feed back into the lake after pieces of the portions of that body of water have been expelled, where you know beings can be reincorporated, practices can be honored. um so yeah, so I'm sorry, I just like, where do you how do you see that?
Yeah, it is a complicated history, and I really appreciate what you're saying. And it's true that Buddhism has often bound itself to dominant power, to the kings and empires or wealthy lords that could support it, for better and worse.
And that happens also when Buddhism gets lodged in North American and European spaces too, except that the power seats of power can be different. It can be, neuroscience research labs, or you know corporations who appreciate, the wellness guidance.
Yep. Or just really rich people, just seeking out who has the most money. Um, and that is part of how power operates in our world. So yes, I mean they're together. And I imagine, and this really is just speculation, but I imagine that there were Buddhists, Vajrayana Buddhists in the early days of Tibet who felt much closer and more intimacy with what we now call Bun or indigenous Tibetan traditions and really did not see conflict or opposition or even, had deep reverence for those teachings. And then others who had a more imperialistic and more maybe violent relationship with it. So, rather than totalizing it and seeing it as, Buddhism is always part of power, domination, empire, or Buddhism is always wonderful and in support of all the good things, it's always complex. And there are
Mhm.
some people and some institutions that will lean in both ways. If you go to the other end of the history of Tibet before the communist invasion, with the Rime movement, especially in Eastern Tibet, that influenced many of our traditions, there was a tremendous attempt to reclaim the Bun tradition and some of the older myths, like the Gesar myths and legends, and some of the practices that they were concerned were going to disappear.
And in
So,
some of your writing, you describe the Rime movement as a partial decolonization of the Tibetan Buddhist imagination. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one story we could tell about Tibetan Buddhism is an increasing orthodoxy that moves towards scholarship, towards large monastic communities, and a critique of some of the more um, embodied ritual dimensions. That's very partial because, of course, those embodied ritual dimensions are just all over Tibet, all over Vajrayana Buddhism, including the monastic, scholarly institutions. They're doing puja. I mean, it's not absolute what I'm saying, but I think there is a tendency towards establishing power and a certain prominence through scholarship, through the intellect, through visualization and sadhana practice and some of the more material practices, amulet building, ritual spirit work, certain kinds of more material culture that is actually kind of looked down upon. And so with the Rime movement, you do have an attempt to reclaim some of those dimensions, especially in relationship to Bun. There's this strange tradition, uh, strange to me, maybe you could say, called the Jutik, this knot tying divination.
Oh, yeah.
It's a big deal. It's a whole system. I don't know much about it, but I know that Mipam and Jamgon Control, Lodrotaye, these great Rime masters, like did their best to compile these giant texts. One of the largest texts that Mipam wrote. He's known as an academic, philosophical guy, but one of the largest texts, I think the largest text that he wrote was on this Jutic divination knot tying system. And I think they really were trying to create a way to return and protect certain traditions, Gesar legends, Gesar myth being one of the most important. And in the Gesar narratives, you do have this like almost greenhouse that has preserved these stories and different deities and different entities and different rituals that would have been lost otherwise. So yeah, there's a certain decolonization that happens in that more ecumenical perspective that arose in the Rime moment.
Can you talk about how you feel or how you see what could be described as a new Buddhist animism today?
I think the way into it will have to be a questioning of transcendence and immanence on a very deep level that the sense that ultimately Dharma is about enlightenment and that enlightenment is about the unconditional and that the unconditional is about going beyond transcending the world of suffering. That has to be really brought into a dance with the sense that the world already as it is sacred and communicative and complete. So there is a tension in those two perspectives. And I think that there's something about being able to work fluidly across those, the transcendent and the immanent, and hold them together that is both ethically and politically important for our earth and for what kinds of Dharma communities we have, but also for our awakening. That when awakening, when enlightenment is always relegated to something beyond this world, something is missing, something is bypassed, something is not included. But on the other hand, if we entirely focus on the immanent, if we are only interested in, let's say, re-embedding in place, in body, in land, in seasons, in culture, there is also something that's missing there. There is also an aspect of uh, awakening and freedom that is transcendent, that Buddhism offers something so important, access to a kind of freedom, um, a wrongdroll, right? A natural freedom that is available, that is the very condition of all phenomena. So to me, this is the way in. If we're going to really be Buddhists about it, we have to work and grapple with that tension, transcendence and immanence. If we walk through that door together, we will have a Dharma that's responsive to our times, and a Dharma that is creative um, in its relationship with this more than human world and the ecological context of our practice. When people ask me about eco-dharma, I often will say that for me, eco-dharma means that your dharma practice is the earth. It's not that your Dharma practice is embedded in the earth or is in an environment, or that we apply our inner practice to the outer world, but that we see a single existential tissue and a living field of experience that is the earth, that is our own body, that also is our mental events and our awareness. It's a truly non-dual perspective. And for me, that's become very real, where part of my sadhana, part of my spiritual practice is the petrochemical plant a half hour away from my home. Or just this week, I went with a friend and student and we did some ritual work by a methane power generator that's being planned to fuel data centers for AI. That kind of work is not usually considered part of Buddhism necessarily, or maybe not part. It's not the first thing you'd think of when you think of Buddhist practice. For me, it is more and more the first thing I think of, or it's what I want, what I desire, what I want to see is a form of Dharma that is flourishing in a living and entangled relationship with place, with infrastructure, with technology, with the more than human world, in a truly non-dual fashion. You and I come from these traditions of charnel ground yogis and yoginis. We come from a tradition where you move towards the totality of experience, and you even let your body be consumed, and you enter fully into this world without hesitation. And I want to encourage, and I want to see an ecological Dharma, an animist Buddhism that is, fully participating even materially in this living earth as our practice, not even as an application of our
Mhm,
practice.
mhm. That resonates a lot with me. As we mentioned in the beginning, part of what have opened pathways for us into this kind of exploration has been the series of ruptures in our communities and therefore in our relationships when abuse became evident and then was not being addressed or acknowledged. um, and when we're thinking about an ethical way of being that honors our relationships and seeks to respect sources of knowledge, we both had to radically rethink our spiritual paths. And so that that if you're thinking about, continuing to value ancestors and respect lineage, that I'm imagine that you have, and I know that I have had to do some very careful work to continue to value what I've received and the flowing streams through which that is being transmitted, while also acknowledging that there are some, interpersonal dynamics that I'm not able to continue to participate in or contribute to. And in my case, and this is another thing as we keep noticing that we share, is that for me, the academic training where I had languages like Sanskrit and classical Tibetan that allowed me access back to texts, back to the written sources, and also back to other sources of inspiration, was extremely important, um, during that time, and also looking at the practices themselves, and seeing what resonated. And I just kind of, wonder how you've worked through this question of maintaining the kind of, you know, respectful relationship while also, you know, taking an ethical position with regard to the harm that we saw doing that in some ways, we were part of the structure of reproducing.
Yeah. Yes. Well, maybe just starting with that last point, for me, it was very clear I was part of a hierarchy of teachers in Shambhala that that was part of creating a really unhealthy culture. And that was a big part of my life, my formation for 20, 25 years. And so some of that for me has meant doing some unlearning of those patterns that I was formed within, seeing myself in a certain hierarchy and my proximity and closeness to the main teacher that made me more special than someone else. Um, and then for me, as a white North American man, there's other social formations that I was, just socialized into in my own being. So for me now, has Dharma practice means unlearning some of that habituation in an ongoing way, and that's a lifelong unlearning process. Um, and that opens me up, I think, to uh, the complexity of these lineage histories and what it means to be part of an ancestral stream or part of a living lineage. And I think one of the fantasies of the early moments of Western Buddhism, especially around Vajrayana, was the sense that very kind of black and white thinking. And I thought like this. So I don't mean to disparage anyone else. But for me, it was like Western modern things bad, ancient Tibetan things good. In a very, if you really pushed the point. And that black and white thinking, that yes or no dualistic thinking is not particularly helpful. So now that we have seen that within the tremendous wisdom of these lineages, there's also violence, harm, ignorance, patriarchy, and we have acknowledged that and have metabolized that, it means it's no longer clear what's black and white or good and bad or right and wrong. And it's a richer, more complex inquiry. And I think that's healthy. And it doesn't mean that you lose connection with Dharma. And I would encourage more and more Western modern practitioners to open to that complexity. Part of that is knowing the histories. This is nothing new. Tibetans went through this too. There are many, many lineage stories of people losing connection with their teacher and tremendous violence happening, possible leaders of lineages being pushed off of the top of monasteries, infighting and war between different lineages, people being poisoned. The Tibetans were very aware that there were some challenging aspects of their own tradition that wasn't living up to real bodhicitta and selflessness. And so I don't think we're alone, even though there are unique qualities to the modern moment in the cultural translation. I think that the lineage itself goes back and back through lots of complexity and people wrestling with the challenges. So I actually think we're quite traditional, strangely enough, in a way. Um, One of the things that you do learn from an academic historical perspective is that Vajrayana Buddhism is always being reinvented, recreated. Every generation, there are new outpourings of tremendous teachings and innovations, and that was in response to changes and challenges and problems. And it's not a static tradition. And I think a lot of Western practitioners assume that it was like one thing that happened for exactly the same way for 2,500 years, and we received the exact pure essence of that one thing, and we have to do it exactly like that.
And
His
we ruined it.
and we either we ruined it or right, that's right. And it's just not true. These traditions were nobody did Nundro in India.
Mhm.
So, you know, things
Right,
change.
right.
And I think we're part of a living lineage that it's okay to grapple with and to be creative, and to be humble, because that's the other side of this is there is the danger of presuming that as Westerners or as modern people or as educated people that we know better. And there's tremendous
Mhm,
arrogance and irreverence. And I think I'm always trying to stay in touch with that more devotional and humble side of surrender that I did learn, through the Tibetan tradition, and bring that in together with in a dance with a more critical stance. And I think,
mhm,
both sides are healthy.
mhm. And drawing on the resources in Buddhism that are very rich and underutilized, that train us to be able to stay in places of ethical ambiguity and multivalence
Mm,
and, the lack of polarized perspectives that anyone would think would be valid.
yes. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, each one of these themes is bottomless, and I think our friendship and shared background enables us to go quite deep, but there's always so much more, and it feels
Mm,
like we're just starting in a way. So I'm
we are just
looking
starting.
looking forward to the ongoing friendship and
Me too.
conversation. Yeah.
Me too. Very much. Thanks so much, friend.
Thank you.
Deep bow.